Right now, at this very moment, someone in America just checked their bank account and felt their stomach drop. Not because they went on a shopping spree, not because they're careless with money, not because they made some catastrophic financial mistake, but because the math simply doesn't work anymore. The rent that was manageable last year has climbed another $200. The electric bill that used to be annoying is now genuinely terrifying. The grocery trip that should cost $100 somehow rings up at $170. And here's the part that nobody in power wants to acknowledge. If you're feeling this pressure crushing down on you right now, you are not alone, and you are absolutely not doing anything wrong. The system itself, the very foundation of the American economy, has fundamentally changed in ways that make traditional financial advice almost useless. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how we got to this breaking point, why everything feels so impossibly expensive even when the news tells you inflation is under control, what this means for your future and your family's future, and most importantly, why recognizing these patterns is the first step toward not getting completely crushed by them. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Understanding the game is the only way to stop losing at it. And right now, millions of Americans are losing without even realizing the rules changed decades ago. Let me show you something that should make your blood run cold. Something that captures this crisis better than any government statistic or economic report ever could. There's a woman in her 20s, working full-time, doing everything society told her to do. She gets her paycheck, and like a responsible adult, she puts money into her savings account. $50, $100, whatever she can manage. She looks at that balance and feels a tiny spark of hope, like maybe she's finally getting ahead, maybe she's building something. And then 2 days later, maybe 3 if she's lucky, she's withdrawing that exact same money. Not for a concert, not for new clothes or a night out with friends, for gas to get to work, for groceries to eat, for the absolute bare minimum basics of existence. She's doing everything right, following every piece of conventional wisdom, and it's still not enough. It's never enough. That's not a personal failure. That's not poor planning or a lack of discipline. That's a system failure. That's an economy that has fundamentally broken the promise it made to working Americans. And it's happening to millions of people who thought they understood how money was supposed to work, who believed that hard work and smart choices would lead to stability and progress. Now here's the thing that older generations often don't fully grasp, and I'm not saying this to create conflict or point fingers, but to highlight a crucial disconnect. When someone in their 60s or 70s says, "Just work harder, that's what we did, nobody handed us anything," they're not necessarily wrong about their own experience. But they are comparing two completely different economies, two entirely separate versions of America that happen to share the same name. In the late 70s and 80s, wages and housing costs moved together in a relatively predictable relationship. You could graduate high school or college, get a job, work hard for a few years, and realistically buy a house in your 20s without needing a six-figure income, without rich parents funding your down payment, without some extraordinary stroke of luck. It was normal, expected, even. A college degree back then didn't saddle you with debt that follows you into your 40s, haunting every major life decision. Healthcare costs, childcare expenses, transportation, all of it was dramatically lower when adjusted for what people actually earned. The relationship between income and expenses made sense. It was possible to get ahead, to build wealth, to achieve what we called the American dream without requiring perfection or extraordinary circumstances. But here's where it gets absolutely crazy, where the numbers become so stark that they're almost hard to believe. The average worker today, when you properly adjust for inflation and buying power, earns roughly the same as a worker in 1979. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 50 years of economic growth, technological advancement, productivity increases, corporate profits reaching historic highs, and wages for the typical worker barely moved at all. Meanwhile, and this is the part that makes the whole situation feel almost deliberately cruel, the essential costs of living have exploded by more than 70%. Not luxury items, not optional purchases, the things you absolutely need to survive and function in modern society. Housing, food, transportation, healthcare, education. This isn't about avocado toast or being too picky about jobs or any of the dismissive stereotypes that get thrown around. This is about a fundamental mathematical impossibility. This is about an economy where the numbers literally do not add up for tens of millions of people who are doing everything they're supposed to do. So what happened? How did we get here? It's not one single villain or policy or moment. It's three major forces that collided over decades, each one making the situation progressively worse, each one benefiting certain groups while devastating others. First, decades of easy credit and historically low interest rates inflated asset prices to levels that would have seemed insane to previous generations. Homes and investments skyrocketed in value, which sounds great if you already own those things. If you were a homeowner in 1990, the last 30 years made you wealthier than you ever imagined possible, often without you doing anything at all. Your house just became worth 3 or 4 times what you paid for it. But if you were trying to enter the market, if you were young or working class or just starting out, those same forces priced you out completely. The gap between people who own assets and people who don't has turned into a chasm. Second, corporate consolidation means fewer and fewer companies control more and more of what you can't live without. When only a handful of massive corporations dominate groceries, utilities, healthcare, and housing, prices don't just rise naturally with inflation. They stay high because there's no real competition forcing them down. When 4 companies control 80% of the beef market, they can set prices. When a few massive property management firms own tens of thousands of rental units in a city, they can coordinate rent increases. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented market consolidation that economists across the political spectrum acknowledge as a problem. And third, the fundamental economic model shifted. Your parents' generation, or your grandparents, often had one full-time job with benefits that could comfortably support an entire household. A factory worker, a secretary, a mid-level manager could buy a house, raise kids, save for retirement, and take a vacation every year. One income, one job, economic security. Today, people work 2 jobs, sometimes 3, with multiple income streams and side hustles, and they still struggle to make rent in a 1-bedroom apartment. The gig economy, the erosion of unions, the shift from pensions to 401ks, the stagnation of the minimum wage, all of it combined to transfer wealth and security upward while leaving working Americans with less stability than their parents had. This creates a psychological whiplash that's genuinely hard to describe unless you're living through it right now. You're told to follow the playbook, the same advice that worked for previous generations. Work hard, save consistently, make smart choices, don't waste money, be responsible. And you do all of that. You follow every rule. You make sacrifices. You budget carefully. And yet the playbook doesn't work anymore because it's based on an economy that doesn't exist. The cost of entry into basic middle-class stability, just the starting point of what used to be called a normal life, has climbed faster than wages, faster than opportunity, faster than hope itself. You're not failing at the game. The game changed, and nobody bothered to tell you the new rules. Now let's talk about the single biggest crisis crushing Americans harder than anything else. The thing that shows up in every conversation about financial stress. The issue that dominates every family budget. Housing. For millions of people across this country, this isn't some abstract policy debate happening in Washington or an interesting topic for economists to discuss. This is sitting in your car after a long shift at work, staring at your phone, trying to figure out how you're going to make rent next month without skipping meals or letting another bill go unpaid. This is the anxiety that wakes you up at 3 in the morning and won't let you go back to sleep. One woman in Florida lays out her situation with a kind of exhausted clarity that hits you in the chest. She pays $1,300 a month in rent for a basic apartment, nothing fancy, just a place to live. $650 for her car payment because she needs reliable transportation to get to her job. $300 for car insurance because that's not optional if you want to drive legally. And she's already underwater, already drowning, before utilities, groceries, healthcare, phone bill, internet, before any of the other expenses that make up modern life even enter the picture. Her voice cracks when she describes the impossible choice she faces every single month. I either eat or I pay my bills. And even then, it's like, which bill is going to be late this month? Which company am I going to have to call and beg for an extension? That's not mismanagement. That's not someone living beyond their means or making foolish choices. That's what happens when housing costs have completely detached from what ordinary workers can afford to pay. And the numbers, the cold hard data, backs up her experience and the experience of millions of others. The median home price in America right now sits somewhere around $410,000 to $420,000, depending on which week you check and which data source you use. For $100,000. For a median home, not a mansion, not a luxury property, just a regular house in a regular neighborhood. Now here's the part that should terrify anyone under 40. That's nearly 6 times the median household income. 6 times. A generation ago, when your parents or grandparents were buying their first homes, that ratio was roughly 3 to 1. It's doubled. The relationship between what people earn and what houses cost has completely broken down. Home ownership went from being a realistic goal for anyone with a decent job and some discipline to something that requires both significant financial resources and extraordinary luck. Like winning a lottery, you have to be qualified to enter. But wait, you might be thinking, renting was supposed to be the affordable alternative, right? The option for people who aren't ready to buy or who want more flexibility. Not anymore, not even close. The typical one-bedroom apartment in America averages about $1,500 a month nationwide. And that's the average, which means it includes cheaper rural areas and small towns. In actual cities where the jobs are, where economic opportunity exists, you're looking at numbers that would have seemed impossible just a decade ago. San Diego, New York, Boston, Miami, Seattle, San Francisco, you're easily looking at $2,500 to $3,000 or more for a one-bedroom apartment. For one bedroom. For the privilege of having a roof over your head and a space barely large enough for a bed, a couch, and a small table. Rents did drop slightly from their insane 2022 peak, and the media celebrated this like it was some kind of victory for renters. But they're still roughly 15% higher than they were before the pandemic. The cost of housing didn't cool off and return to normal. It just reached a new, higher, more expensive normal that feels completely unsustainable for anyone who isn't in the top 20% of earners. Why is this happening? What are the actual forces driving this crisis? It's a perfect storm of factors that have been building for years, each one making the problem worse, each one incredibly difficult to solve. For years after the 2008 financial crash, America simply didn't build enough homes to meet demand. Construction slowed dramatically, developers got cautious, regulations made building more expensive, and the industry never fully recovered to pre-crash levels of production. We've been running a housing deficit for over a decade, building fewer units than we need, and that shortage accumulated year after year. Then, just as the market was starting to stabilize, mortgage rates climbed from historic lows around 3% to 6 and 7% in a remarkably short period. That change alone increased monthly payments by 40 to 50% for anyone trying to buy the exact same house. The door to home ownership, which was already narrow, slammed shut for millions of first-time buyers who suddenly couldn't qualify for loans or couldn't afford the payments even if they could qualify. At the exact same time, investors swept into the market with a level of aggression we've never seen before. Individual landlords, small investment firms, and massive institutional buyers like Blackstone purchased tens of thousands of homes, converting what used to be starter houses for young families into rental inventory for corporate portfolios. In some hot markets, investors were making cash offers sight unseen, outbidding regular families who needed a place to live. When housing becomes an investment vehicle for global capital, instead of primarily shelter for people, prices stop being connected to what workers can afford to pay. And in states like Florida and Texas, states that used to be relatively affordable, property insurance has absolutely skyrocketed because of increasing climate risks. Hurricanes, floods, extreme weather events. All of it has made insurers nervous, and they've responded by either dramatically raising rates or pulling out of markets entirely. Homeowners who thought they could afford their mortgage are suddenly facing insurance bills that add hundreds of dollars to their monthly costs. People are being forced to choose between having insurance or having a home at all. When shelter is both scarce and expensive, when supply can't keep up with demand and investors are competing with families, there's zero downward pressure on prices. Families are forced to compete against each other and against people with much deeper pockets. And that competition only drives numbers higher. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle where high prices justify even higher prices because that's what the market will bear. The impact of all this is generational and profound. The average first-time homebuyer in America is now in their mid-30s, the oldest age ever recorded since we started tracking this data. Think about what that means. People are spending their entire 20s, the decade when previous generations were building equity and stability, just trying to save enough for a down payment while watching prices climb faster than they can save. Renting has become a permanent state for tens of millions of Americans, not a temporary stepping stone on the way to ownership. It's just life now, paying someone else's mortgage indefinitely, building zero equity, accumulating zero wealth, stuck. And without home equity, that traditional engine of middle-class wealth building, the wealth gap between people who own property and people who don't just keeps widening. Someone who bought a house in 2012 has seen their net worth increase by hundreds of thousands of dollars just from appreciation, even if they didn't do anything to earn it. Someone who's been renting that whole time has nothing but a pile of receipts. People aren't stuck because they're not working hard enough or making poor choices. They're stuck because the doors to economic stability are locked behind costs they fundamentally cannot control no matter how hard they try. But here's what drives me crazy, what really nobody talks about enough. Even when you somehow manage to secure housing, whether you rent or buy, that's just the beginning of your financial stress. Because once you get those keys, once you have that place to live, a whole new wave of bills arrives that often hits harder than the rent or mortgage itself. These are the costs that don't show up in the housing affordability calculations, but that can absolutely destroy a family budget. Let me paint you a picture that's become disturbingly common. A woman in Texas, trying to survive the brutal summer heat, opens her electric bill, $560 for June. She's shocked but figures it's an anomaly, a mistake maybe. Then July arrives, $650. By August, she's staring at a projection that shows she'll have paid over $2,000 in just 3 months for electricity. $2,000. And before you think she's running some kind of industrial operation out of her home, understand that she's not. She's not running a mansion with the AC set to 60 degrees. She's not leaving lights on all day or being wasteful. She's actively cutting costs everywhere she can, cooking at home to avoid the added heat of the oven, trying to use appliances during off-peak hours, doing everything the utility company suggests. And it's still not enough. The bill still comes, and it's still impossible. Now, her situation is on the extreme end, but the trend is nationwide and accelerating. On paper, when you look at national averages, the typical electric bill is reported as around $150 a month. That sounds manageable, almost reasonable. But that number completely collapses when you look at real conditions that actual families face. In states with brutal summer heat waves that last months, in areas with aging electrical grid systems that aren't efficient, in regions where you genuinely cannot survive without heavy air conditioning use, monthly bills of $400 to $600 during peak months are not unusual at all. They're becoming the norm. And it's not just electricity. Water costs have surged in major cities across the country as infrastructure ages and municipalities struggle to fund repairs. Internet service, which used to be a luxury or optional expense, is now basically mandatory for everything from job applications to kids' homework to basic banking. Try living without it and see how fast you fall behind. Car insurance rates have spiked nationwide, with some drivers seeing their premiums increase 30, 40, even 50% in a single year, even though they haven't had an accident or a ticket. Insurance companies claim it's because of increased costs for repairs and medical expenses, but the result is the same. Another bill that's dramatically higher than it used to be. Individually, each of these increases might seem survivable. $50 more here, $100 more there. But together, cumulatively, they form what I call a second rent. A hidden layer of costs that devours whatever's left after you pay for housing. You think you've budgeted correctly, you think you've got your expenses under control, and then these bills hit, and suddenly there's nothing left for savings, nothing left for emergencies, nothing left for the small things that make life worth living. Then there's transportation, which for most Americans is not optional in any meaningful sense. A man shares his daily routine online, and the exhaustion in his voice is palpable. For hours of driving every day, 2 hours each way, just to get to and from his job. 6 days a week, week after week, month after month. He admits with a kind of defeated honesty that he doesn't even have the time or money left for the simple hobbies and activities he used to enjoy, the things that used to make life feel worth all the struggle. He's not exaggerating or looking for sympathy. He's trying to make sense of an existence that's become nothing but work and commute and work, with no space left for actual living. And he's far from alone. The average monthly payment for a new car in America right now is over $700, with many people, especially those with less than perfect credit, paying well over $1,000 a month. $1,000 a month just for the car payment, before you even add in insurance, gas, maintenance, repairs, registration fees. Used cars, which used to be the affordable option for people on tight budgets, aren't cheap anymore either. The used car market went crazy during the pandemic and never fully corrected. A decent used vehicle that would have cost $8,000 or $10,000 5 years ago now costs $15,000 or $20,000. Between insurance that keeps climbing, gas prices that remain volatile and unpredictable, regular maintenance that cars require, and the rising interest rates that make car loans much more expensive, transportation has become one of the single largest financial drains on the typical American household. It rivals housing in its impact on monthly budgets. But here's the deeper, more insidious problem: necessity. Most Americans, unlike people in many other developed countries, simply don't have reliable public transit. You can't just skip owning a car the way someone in Tokyo or London or even New York City can. Outside of a handful of dense urban cores, American infrastructure demands that you own a vehicle. Work is often far from home. Grocery stores aren't within walking distance. Schools, doctors, everything requires driving. So you need the car to earn money, but then a massive chunk of that money you're earning goes right back into maintaining and operating the car. It's a trap that reinforces itself, a cycle you can't break out of without either finding a new job closer to home, which isn't always possible, or moving closer to work, which brings you right back to the housing affordability crisis we already discussed. You're stuck paying for the privilege of being able to work, which when you really think about it, is a pretty dystopian arrangement. All of this adds up to create a feeling that millions of people share, but rarely articulate clearly. Life in America has become a long list of non-negotiable payments attached to simply existing. Not for luxuries, not for upgrades or nice-to-haves, just for survival, just for the basic ability to function in modern society. Shelter, electricity, water, internet, transportation, these are not optional. You cannot negotiate them away or find creative alternatives. You need all of them, and all of them cost more every single year while your paycheck stays essentially flat. And when even these absolute basics stretch your budget to its breaking point, when there's nothing left over after covering the essentials, there's one final cost you absolutely cannot avoid no matter how tight things get: food. The grocery store is where the entire cost of living crisis becomes completely impossible to ignore or rationalize away. You can negotiate with your landlord for an extra week to pay rent. You can delay a car repair for another month if you're desperate. You can skip vacations entirely for years. You can cancel every subscription service, every small luxury, every discretionary expense. But you cannot stop eating. Your body won't allow it. Your kids won't allow it. Biology doesn't care about your budget. And that's exactly where so many Americans are completely losing control of their finances. In the aisles of Walmart and Kroger and Safeway, watching their grocery bills climb higher and higher with no end in sight. One young woman describes the cycle with a clarity that cuts right through all the economic jargon and statistics. She gets paid, feels that brief moment of relief that comes with money hitting your account, and immediately transfers some amount to savings like she's been told to do, like responsible adults are supposed to do. $50, $100, whatever she can manage. She looks at that savings balance and feels a tiny flicker of hope, like maybe this time she's actually getting ahead. Maybe she's finally building an emergency fund. And then 2 days later, 3 if she's lucky, she's logging back into her banking app and transferring that exact same money right back out. Not for clothes, not for entertainment, not for anything fun or optional, for food, for gas to get to work, for the absolute bare minimum basics required to survive the next 2 weeks until she gets paid again. Every time I put money in savings, she says, voice filled with exhausted frustration, I end up needing it for something essential. It's not extra stuff. It's not wants. It's needs. Food, gas, basics. That's not poor planning. That's not a lack of financial discipline or an inability to delay gratification. That's a giant flashing sign that the essentials themselves, the things human beings require to live, have become fundamentally unaffordable on a typical American wage. And the data, the hard numbers that economists track, confirms exactly what millions of people are experiencing at the grocery store every week. A single adult living alone today typically spends somewhere between $300 and $400 a month on groceries, depending on where they live, what kind of diet they maintain, and how carefully they shop and plan. That's for one person. A family of 4 can easily spend $800 to $1,200 a month or more, especially if they have teenagers who eat like they're storing up for hibernation. And even though the pandemic-era price spikes have slowed down, even though the rate of increase has moderated somewhat, food costs still rise roughly 2 to 3% every single year like clockwork. It never goes down. It just goes up at different speeds. Food inflation never reversed after the pandemic shock. That's the crucial part that politicians and media often gloss over. Prices didn't come back down to where they were. They just stopped rising quite as fast. They plateaued at a new, higher, more expensive level that represents the new normal, which means that every paycheck, even if you get a small raise, buys less food than it did the year before. You're on a treadmill that's gradually speeding up, and no matter how fast you run, you keep falling further behind. But it's not just the price of food that's destroying family budgets. It's access to decent food at reasonable prices. In many neighborhoods scattered across America, especially in low-income urban areas or isolated rural communities, major grocery stores have closed down or consolidated, leaving what researchers call food deserts behind. These are entire communities, sometimes spanning several zip codes, where residents cannot access a real supermarket with fresh produce, quality meats, healthy options. Instead, they're forced to rely on convenience stores, dollar stores, or fast food restaurants because there literally is no major grocery store within reasonable distance. And if you don't have a car, or if you're working multiple jobs and don't have time to travel, you're stuck with whatever's available nearby, which is usually heavily processed, nutritionally poor, and ironically often more expensive per unit than what you'd find at a real grocery store. Fresh fruits and vegetables become scarce and prohibitively expensive. Whole foods, things that aren't pumped full of preservatives and corn syrup, become luxury items. Meanwhile, heavily processed packaged foods stay cheap and accessible because they have long shelf lives and high profit margins. So families trying desperately to stretch their dollars, families making the rational economic choice given their constraints, end up buying what's affordable rather than what's healthy. They know it's not ideal. They understand nutrition. But when you have $40 to feed your family for the next 3 days, you're not buying fresh salmon and organic vegetables. You're buying ramen, frozen dinners, mac and cheese, white bread, peanut butter, things that fill stomachs even if they don't nourish bodies. This creates a hidden cost that most Americans feel in their bodies but don't always connect to economics. Eating cheaper today means paying more later through higher medical bills, lower energy levels that affect job performance, chronic health conditions that develop over years, and stress that compounds with every tough financial decision. Parents ration portions so their kids can eat more. People skip meals entirely to make the food budget stretch another day. Families replace fresh ingredients with shelf-stable alternatives because the math demands it, because survival trumps health when you're living paycheck to paycheck. The grocery bill stops being about nourishment, about fueling your body, about enjoying food. It becomes a source of constant anxiety, another monthly expense that keeps climbing while your income stays flat. And when buying food, the most basic human necessity, feels like a financial burden that you're failing to manage properly, people start asking themselves a deeply painful question. If feeding myself is this hard, if this one thing is such a struggle, what chance do I possibly have with everything else? What hope is there for ever getting ahead? That feeling of perpetually falling behind doesn't stay contained at the grocery store checkout. It follows you home, shows up in your mail, lives in every credit card statement, and manifests in the growing debt that more and more Americans carry month after month, year after year. Because here's the brutal, uncomfortable truth about living in America in 2025. Survival isn't paid for with cash anymore. For millions of families, existence itself is financed, and not because people are chasing luxury lifestyles or buying things they don't need, but because the basic cost of living has completely outpaced what typical paychecks can cover. The math simply doesn't work without borrowing. One creator on social media breaks down her monthly expenses with a kind of raw honesty that makes you want to look away because it's too real, too familiar. Rent, electric, water, car payment, car insurance, groceries, gas. She lists them out one by one, and you can see her adding the numbers in her head. Watch her face as the reality settles in. Then she asks the question that families across America whisper to each other at kitchen tables late at night when the kids are asleep. Which one of these bills can I skip this month? Which one can I pay late and try to catch up on when the next paycheck comes? Can I negotiate with the electric company for an extension? Will the landlord accept partial payment? How many days past can I let the car insurance go before they cancel my policy? That's not irresponsible financial behavior. That's not someone who's bad with money or who made a series of poor life choices. That's what it looks like when income and expenses no longer match, when the cost of existing exceeds what working Americans can earn. And when that gap opens up, credit cards step in to fill it. They become the bridge, the buffer, the thing that allows life to continue when the math says it shouldn't be possible. Over the last year, American households have pushed total credit card balances to over $1.2 trillion. $1,200 billion, the highest level ever recorded in American history. And the average interest rate on those balances now sits above 22%, which is just genuinely cruel when you think about it. 22% interest means that any balance carried from month to month grows faster than most people can realistically pay it down. A $5,000 balance can easily balloon into $7,000 or $8,000 over a couple of years if someone can only afford to make minimum payments. The debt doesn't just sit there. It grows like a living thing, feeding on itself. And here's what absolutely breaks my heart about this entire situation. The overwhelming majority of people carrying these credit card balances aren't doing it for vacations in the Bahamas or designer handbags or new electronics. Multiple surveys from different sources confirm that nearly half of all credit card holders, possibly more, are using their credit cards to pay for essentials. Not wants. Essentials. Groceries when the food money runs out before payday. The gap between rent and what they have in checking. Utility bills that came in higher than expected. Unexpected car repairs that can't wait because the car is needed to get to work. They're not being frivolous or living beyond their means. They're trying to survive in an economy that no longer provides what they need to survive. Medical costs pour gasoline on this fire. Even people with health insurance, which is supposed to protect you from financial catastrophe, find themselves drowning in medical debt because of high deductibles and massive out-of-pocket expenses. You can have insurance and still get destroyed financially by healthcare. Emergency room visits routinely cost thousands of dollars even after insurance. Specialist appointments, surgeries, ongoing treatments for chronic conditions, prescription medications that cost hundreds of dollars a month. None of it waits for you to save up the money. Health issues don't care about your budget. They don't pause politely while you build up your emergency fund. When a medical bill arrives, and it's due before your next paycheck, the credit card becomes your only option. You either charge it or you don't get the care. Those are the choices. Over time, month after month, year after year, this creates a quiet, devastating pattern that millions of Americans are trapped in. Debt becomes normalized. It stops being a temporary emergency measure and becomes a permanent feature of life. Interest charges become expected, just another line item in the budget. Financial breathing room, that sense of having a cushion or margin for error, completely disappears. You're living right at the edge all the time, one unexpected expense away from serious trouble. And here's the thing that makes this even more painful. Wages haven't kept pace with any of this. While the cost of everything has climbed steadily upward, wages for most workers have stagnated or grown at a pace far slower than inflation. When your income stays relatively flat, but prices rise consistently, debt is the only thing that fills the gap. It becomes a necessary tool that people rely on, not because they want to or because they're being irresponsible, but because they literally have no other choice. It's a bridge between the life you're working so hard to build and the life you can currently afford on your actual income. But it's also a trap because every month that balance grows. Every month you're paying more in interest, the financial pressure tightens even more and your options shrink even further. What makes this so much harder, what adds an extra layer of cruelty to the whole situation, is the emotional and psychological weight. People carrying this debt know they're trying their absolute best. They're budgeting carefully, cutting every possible expense, working overtime when it's available, doing everything that financial experts tell them to do. And yet the math still pushes them deeper into borrowed money. With each credit card swipe, each time they choose to charge something because there's simply no cash available, the sense of falling behind deepens. The feeling of failure grows even though they're not actually failing at anything. They're just trying to survive in an economy that's structurally designed in a way that makes survival require financing. If the essentials of life, the things that human beings need to exist, require you to borrow money at 22% interest just to obtain them, what does that do to your sense of stability? What does it do to your confidence about the future? What happens to your long-term goals, your dreams, your plans when you're so focused on just making it through this month that you can't even think about next year? And that constant, unrelenting financial pressure fundamentally shapes how millions of Americans now view their future, their country, and their own lives. Which brings us to something that's much harder to measure than credit card debt or rent prices, but that's equally important and perhaps more devastating in the long run. The toll that all of this financial stress takes on mental health, emotional well-being, and the slow, painful death of what we used to call the American dream. When you really listen carefully to Americans talking about the cost of living, when you pay attention not just to what they're saying, but how they're saying it, there's a moment in almost every conversation where things shift. The discussion stops being purely about money, about dollars and cents and budgets, and becomes about something much heavier and harder to articulate. It's exhausting, but not the normal kind of exhaustion that comes from a long day at work or a busy week. It's a deeper, more corrosive exhaustion that comes from fighting a system that feels heavier every single year, from running as hard as you possibly can and still feeling like you're falling behind, from giving everything you have and realizing it's not enough and it will never be enough. One creator describes his life with a kind of defeated clarity. 6 days a week at work, nearly 4 hours of driving every single day just to commute to and from his job. And at the end of all that effort, at the end of giving almost every waking hour to work and commute, he has no time left and no money left for anything he actually enjoys. Not expensive hobbies, just simple things. Reading, seeing friends, having a hobby, living. He's not asking for sympathy or complaining unreasonably. He's trying to understand, trying to make sense of why effort and reward no longer connect in any logical way. Why doing everything right doesn't lead to anything that feels like success or progress. And the data, the research, the studies confirm what millions already feel in their bodies and minds every day. A clear majority of Americans, across age groups and income levels, report feeling stressed about their finances on a daily or nearly daily basis. Not occasionally worried, not stressed during particularly tight months. Every day, constant, unrelenting financial stress. Rising rent, unpredictable utility bills, mounting debt, unexpected expenses, the pressure to keep up, the fear of falling behind. All of it creates a sense of strain that never fully goes away. It's always there, humming in the background, coloring every decision, limiting every possibility. Even when people do absolutely everything right, when they budget carefully and track every expense and work extra shifts whenever possible and cut every non-essential item, they still feel like the ground is moving beneath their feet. Like no matter what they do, the rules keep changing in ways designed to ensure they can't win. And that feeling, that sense of fighting a losing battle against forces you can't control, is incredibly damaging to mental health over time. This isn't about personal failure or individual weakness. Nobody is suggesting that financial stress means you're mentally weak or that you just need to try harder. This is about living in an economic system where the cost of basic stability has climbed dramatically faster than most people's ability to pay for it. Where doing things the right way, following all the conventional wisdom, still leaves you vulnerable and insecure. The emotional impact is measurable and real. Financial pressure affects romantic relationships, with money being one of the top sources of conflict between partners. It shapes family dynamics, with parents feeling guilty and inadequate because they can't provide the way they want to. It influences long-term planning, with people unable to imagine a future that looks better than their present. Parents lie awake at night worrying about whether they can provide for their children, whether they're failing their kids by not giving them opportunities or security. Young adults question whether they will ever be able to afford a home, start a family, achieve any of the milestones that were just normal expected parts of life for previous generations. Workers wonder if they will ever reach a point where they're not just constantly catching up, where they can actually get ahead and build something instead of just treading water indefinitely. People begin to feel fundamentally disconnected from the future they imagined for themselves when they were younger. The path toward a good life, toward stability and comfort and security, keeps getting narrower and more difficult to navigate. What used to be a wide road accessible to anyone willing to work hard has become a tightrope that requires not just hard work, but also perfect balance, exceptional luck, and circumstances beyond your control, all aligning favorably. This is where the idea of the American dream enters the conversation, and I don't mean that as nostalgia or sentimentality. I mean it as a genuine measure of how expectations and possibilities have changed over time. For decades, generations, the promise at the heart of American identity was relatively simple and straightforward. Work hard, make good decisions, play by the rules, and life will gradually, steadily get better. Not perfect, not easy, but better. Each generation would do a bit better than their parents. Kids would have more opportunity than their parents had. Hard work would be rewarded with progress and security. That promise feels fragile now, cracked, maybe even broken for many Americans. Home ownership, which used to be achievable in your 20s, is now delayed until your mid-30s or later. Savings accounts don't grow fast enough to keep pace with rising costs, so the emergency fund you build gets wiped out by a single crisis. Economic mobility, that core belief that each generation will be better off than the last, has slowed to a crawl or reversed entirely for many families. People aren't giving up on ambition or dreams or hope, but they are are running directly into structural barriers that previous generations simply did not have to face at anything like the same scale. The rules changed fundamentally, but the advice stayed the same. Just work harder. Just be more responsible. Just make better choices. As if the problem is effort or character rather than an economic system that has tilted further and further away from working people over decades. And yet, despite all these immense challenges, despite how hard everything has become, many Americans still hold on to something important, something that shouldn't be dismissed or overlooked. They still believe that life shouldn't just be about barely getting by. They want time with family, space to breathe, the ability to plan for the future without constant anxiety. Not perfection, not luxury, just basic stability and dignity. That desire itself, that refusal to accept that constant struggle should be the permanent human condition, is evidence that hope hasn't completely disappeared. It's just become much harder to reach under the crushing weight of today's economy. People are tired, stressed, struggling, but they haven't given up. They're just asking for honesty about what they're facing, for acknowledgement that this is hard in ways that it didn't used to be, for a recognition that the system has changed and the old playbook doesn't work anymore. So where does all of this leave us? What are we supposed to do with all this information, all these statistics and stories and structural problems? When you step back and look at everything together, when you see the complete picture of the housing crisis, the utility shock, the grocery squeeze, the debt trap, the mental and emotional toll, it becomes absolutely clear that this isn't just an economic story about numbers on a chart. This is a human story about millions of people trying to live decent lives in a system that increasingly seems designed to prevent exactly that. The cost of living in America in 2025 isn't measured only in dollars and cents, though the financial numbers are certainly devastating enough. It's measured in chronic stress that affects physical health, in time lost, time that could be spent with family or pursuing passions or just resting, but instead is spent working extra hours or commuting or worrying about money, in dreams that get postponed year after year because the basics consume everything, in relationships strained by financial pressure, in children who absorb their parents' stress even when parents try to hide it, in the gradual erosion of hope that things will meaningfully improve. But here's something crucial to understand. Recognizing all of this, really seeing and understanding the system and the forces at work, doesn't mean accepting it as permanent or inevitable. It means recognizing that these pressures, these struggles, are not personal moral failures. They are structural barriers that millions of people are facing simultaneously. You are not failing. The system is failing you. And understanding that distinction is genuinely important for your mental health and for any hope of things improving. The real question isn't whether this is hard, because obviously it is. The question is, which part of this reality hits closest to home for you personally? Is it housing, the feeling of throwing money away on rent while home ownership gets further out of reach every year? Is it food, the stress of watching your grocery bill climb while your paycheck stays flat? Is it debt, the weight of knowing you're borrowing just to survive and watching interest charges pile up? Or is it just that general feeling of running as fast as you possibly can, doing everything right, and still somehow falling behind? Still losing ground? Understanding your specific pressure points, naming what's actually crushing you, is the first step toward making different choices or advocating for different policies, or at least not blaming yourself for systemic failures. This isn't about self-help or bootstrapping your way out of structural problems, but it is about clarity, about seeing things as they actually are rather than as we're told they should be. If this breakdown, if really diving into the numbers and the stories and the human reality behind the statistics, has given you a clearer perspective on why everything feels so impossibly expensive right now, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who's blaming themselves for struggling. Share it with someone who thinks they're alone in this. Because nobody should have to navigate this economy feeling isolated or like their struggles are unique personal failures. The system changed fundamentally. The rules shifted. The American dream became exponentially harder to reach. And it's time we all understood exactly how and why that happened. That's the only way anything ever gets better, through collective understanding that leads to collective pressure for change. You're not crazy for thinking it shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't be. And recognizing that truth is where everything has to start.